title and the introduction. So today we have a presentation entitled USDA Forest Service Perspectives on Forest Management in a Changing Climate from Laatsch at, am I pronouncing that right? Laatsch?
Yep, that's it.
Laatsch from Utah University, Zhao from Purdue University. So I'm going to go ahead and share the presentation now. And okay, go ahead and get started, you guys.
All right. So hello, everyone. My name is Zhao. I'm assistant professor in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at Purdue University. As of a year ago, I was actually at Utah State University. That's why Jamie and I are advisor and advisee, but we actually belong to two different institutions right now. So people may be confused. That's why I moved. So I just want to take a couple minutes and give you a brief introduction of our research and talk a little bit about the umbrella USDA NIFA project that Jamie and I are part of. And then I will introduce Jamie Laatsch, and who actually carried out most of the work and also will be giving today's presentation. So in 2011, Dr. Karen Mott at Utah State University, the lead PI, along with a group of faculty members across multiple disciplines, successfully obtained a USDA NIFA National Needs Fellowship Program Award. So the idea of this program award is to create a small cohort of graduate students at USU whose research will be linked under the theme Managing for Resilience in Forested Ecosystems of the Intermountain West. So these NIFA fellows will be conducting research under the supervision of their faculty advisor to examine issues related to the management, adaptation, and resilience and human dimensions of forest ecosystems in a changing climate. So as a part of the faculty team, I was presenting the field of natural resource policy and social science research, and we recruited Jamie Laatsch as one of our first National Need Fellows at USU. And Jamie and I got together and we looked at, forest management issue in the Intermountain West from our perspective, what is really important. Definitely, climate change is something people have been talking about for a long time, and the Forest Service has put a lot of efforts to try to address climate change in their management of the national forest system. So Jamie and I thought this would be a very interesting and useful topic to look into and potentially use the research to help inform better decision-making at the agency level down the road. So we picked this topic, and we're particularly interested in the policy dimension of how USDA Forest Service has been addressing climate change. Right? So Jamie will talk a little bit about this survey research we have been working on in the past 2 years, titled USDA Forest Service Perspectives on Forest Management in a Changing Climate. So I will give the floor to Jamie.
Do we still have a view of the presentation, or do I pull that up?
Yeah, I actually just found the place to make you presenter. So
okay.
If you share your desktop now, Jamie, that should work.
Okay, let me pull this up. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Yep.
Great.
Looks good.
As Zhao mentioned, my name is Jamie Laatsch. I'm a graduate research assistant at Utah State. And today we'll talk to you a bit about the research we've been working on. And the title obviously is related to the perspectives of these Forest Service employees in regards to forest management now that climate change has been a big priority for the Forest Service. Is my volume level okay?
Yes.
Okay. So today I'll run through, Zhao talked a little bit already about our purpose, why we decided to do this research, but I'll talk a little bit about some background and give some context for the research we did, talk about some of our methods that we used, run through our preliminary findings, and talk about our plans moving forward and what we hope to do with what we've learned. So as Zhao mentioned, we're interested in looking at the Forest Service specifically and how they, as an agency, as an organization, take on and address climate change. What are sort of their strategies and plans, and how well have those been implemented? So the research we did sort of has three key parts. The first is more of a theoretical look at how the organization, the Forest Service, takes on new problems. And so we bring in a few frameworks and really try and analyze that from a more theoretical perspective. But for the purpose of today's talk, we'll do the more practical, taking a look at how well the Forest Service has implemented these plans to address climate change. And if not very well, why not? So our geographic area of interest, as I believe Zhao mentioned, was the Intermountain West. But there are a couple of different definitions depending on who you ask. So I sort of attempted to make this little map here. The circle's not great, but if you imagine state boundary lines, we included Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. So for us, that was, or for the Forest Service, in terms of their regions, that included parts of regions 1 through 4. And I believe most of you all, if I heard correctly from Shannon, are in sort of southwestern Colorado. So later on in the talk, I'll target some of the results we've had from Region 2 and Region 3, sort of that Colorado, Wyoming, Arizona, New Mexico area. Another part of the research that we were really interested in looking at was a comparison not only between these different regions and different parts of the states, but how the different perceptions and opinions of these Forest Service employees might change depending on what level of the agency they work at. So not only regions 1 through 4, but also employees who work at a ranger district versus employees who work at a forest supervisor's office, regional employees, and even some Washington office people. So as I mentioned, that first part of our research, more theoretical. So we looked at how institutions like the Forest Service take on these challenges like climate change. More specifically, we really looked at how information and knowledge are transferred and flow through the Forest Service when it comes to climate change. And also how the culture of the organization, so maybe leader practices, trust, motivation, willingness to share and collaborate, how that might affect employee performance and their ability to address some of these issues related to climate change. So we did some background. We did a literature review to get a better idea of, sort of what previous literature and academia had to say on the subject. In general, we learned that the Forest Service, while it's done a great job of coming up with new strategies and making new plans, it still struggles with implementation a bit. And so we wanted to look more specifically at the Forest Service's documents to get a sense of how the Forest Service sort of felt on this and just get more information from them specifically. This quote on the page is from one of their documents, the scorecard. So the backbone of the Forest Service's sort of new plans, or when it comes to addressing climate change, the backbone of their plans are these three documents. First is the strategic framework for responding to climate change. The second is the national roadmap, and the third is the corresponding performance scorecard. These really made up, for us, the first two were sort of a way for the Forest Service to lay out their objectives and goals when it came to responding to climate change. And the performance scorecard was more of a way for them to monitor themselves and keep track of how well they've implemented these new goals and plans. So on the left of this page, you'll see a copy of the scorecard. It's essentially 10 questions that each unit, forest or grassland, national forest and national land, must answer each year. It was created by the Washington office, and they receive these reports once a year and sort of keep track of how well they're doing. So I sort of enlarged some of all of the different elements or categories on the right side. So you'll see it's everything from employee education to vulnerability assessments, partnerships, monitoring, carbon assessment. There's a lot of different factors and a lot of things that they're keeping track of. So the Washington office set a goal to have 100% of their units of the national forests and grasslands to be able to answer yes to 10 of those questions by 2015. And so, well, I guess I should say here, so the strategic framework was created, I believe, in 2008. The national roadmap and scorecard came in 2010. So in 2011, they had sort of a baseline assessment and found that 16% of those units had met the goal. And just half were able to say yes to 5 or 6 of those different questions. And then in 2013, they obviously keep track of this every year, but in 2013, the most recent, just under 50% had the goal of the step 10. So they've definitely made some progress, but we're still looking for areas where they can continue to improve. There's only about a year left until they meet that 2015, and so we're looking for places where they can really improve, and we still were interested in learning more about what the employees had to say about all this. So we did our research in 2 phases. The first was a series of key informant interviews. We wanted to make sure we knew what employees were interested in, what issues were important to employees, and sort of getting a sense of whether or not the questions we wanted to ask were relevant and things that they cared about. So we did 12 interviews. We're able to get in touch with people from different regions in our geographic area and also different levels of the agency. So we got a group of people, but it was a very small sample, and so some of the things we learned were very helpful for moving forward, but obviously it might not reflect, the opinions and views of everyone in that area. So some of the things we learned, one of the first things was that there seems to be a lack of agreement when it comes to climate change impacts. So in some cases depending on the region and others depending on the level, many employees were still sort of waiting for that extra evidence and proof. They thought there was a chance that maybe some of these, bark beetle infestations or wildfires might still be within levels of historic regimes. So maybe they're still waiting on a little more proof before they're ready to definitively say this is because of or influenced by climate change. The second was related to the adaptive capacity of the agency. So we found, I think as maybe we expected, the Washington office was very gung-ho and very optimistic that the Forest Service was going to be able to meet these challenges and take on climate change. The ranger district level interviewees were also moderately optimistic, a little bit more optimistic than the other levels about, they felt the employees really were wanting to take this on and were optimistic that there's a good chance that they could. The supervisors level and the regional level employees were the least optimistic when it came to the Forest Service's adaptive capacity. The third thing we learned was that there's still a lot of confusion regarding the scorecard, who's responsible for it. Employees weren't sure what their role necessarily was. Maybe they had heard of the scorecard, but they'd never seen it. There's just a bit of confusion as to who was responsible for the scorecard, and if maybe it wasn't filled out, they weren't sure what sort of repercussions might even come of it. And finally, managers feeling overwhelmed. So employees, time and time again in these interviews, would bring up the fact that they felt like there was information overload. So they were getting tons of emails and all this information about climate change, and many were interested but just did not feel like they had the time to sort of sort through it. So we completed those interviews and moved on to the second phase of our research, which was an online survey. So we sent nearly 3,500 online surveys to respondents, or potential respondents throughout the Intermountain West, and over 1,600 employees responded, which gave us a response rate of 47%, which we were pretty excited about. Before we sent the survey, we did pre-test and sent it out actually in 2 stages. The first was to regional level employees in early September. We wanted to try and miss that sort of fiscal year turnover, but we waited to send the surveys to the forest level and district level employees until after fire season was over, and then there was the government shutdown. So we waited until later in the fall, closer to the winter, to send the second half of those. We sent these surveys to all employees who fit our criteria in this geographic region. So anyone who was maybe a manager or a specialist or a planner that had sort of a hand in the management of the natural resources in the national forests, all of those people received a survey. Employees who maybe didn't receive a survey might be IT personnel, HR personnel, or facilities and maintenance staff. At the time, we really needed to target what we thought were a specific group of people who maybe had a hand in the natural resource management and the vegetative management, and so we made that call and really targeted everyone in the region who fit that criteria. So it was more of a census, less of a sampling. So here's a brief profile of some of our respondents. So this is we did pull this out from all of our respondents, so this isn't just regional people, this is everyone. We got back, like I said, over 1,600 responses. 7% of those were associated with a regional office, 29% with supervisor's office, and 64% with district office. Really a quarter, plus or minus in some of those places, but almost an equal amount from each region, which we were happy about. And the sort of mean for the number of years people had worked for the Forest Service was a little over 18 years. This is more demographic data. So as you can see, most employees that responded to our survey came from GS7 to GS14. Most had a bachelor's degree or graduate degree. And these are just some examples of some of the potential job titles that people might have had. I believe the most common came from fire and fuel specialists and managers, forestry professionals, staff scientists, and maybe range and rec people. And again, I'll go back. Again, we realized we definitely didn't cover everyone who worked for the Forest Service in that area, but we tried to target specialists and managers who maybe had a hand in the planning and management of the natural resources, and just for the purposes of that survey. So the first question we asked employees was, what do you enjoy most about working for the Forest Service? And maybe as expected, many people really enjoyed at least the idea of the opportunity of working outdoors and spending time in nature and knowing that they're helping to manage and conserve the environment and natural resources. Far fewer were really excited or at least enjoyed meeting new people most of anything that they can think of. So some preliminary results. We are still in the final process of analyzing some of that second round of data. So most of the beginning results I'll share here are specific to regional level employees, but still learned quite a bit from that group of people, so we were pretty excited. One of the things we asked them about was climate change being sort of a new challenge, bringing new issues and conditions unlike the past, versus climate change as simply a buzzword. And for regional level employees, over 3/4 believe that climate change is something new, bringing new conditions and issues unlike the past. Near 90% believe that climate change was either moderate or significant concern for forest managers, but fewer believed that climate change moderately or significantly affected the work that they do personally. When it came to how they believed climate change should be addressed by the Forest Service, sort of more in general, over half of the respondents thought that they maybe don't need to necessarily change the way they think about or do their jobs, but some adjustments certainly need to be made to better incorporate it into their management and planning. The other options, a smaller percentage thought that they needed to sort of do a complete overhaul, change the way they approached their jobs and thought about things, and then the small percentage thought that they didn't need to change the way they thought about or did their jobs, but they needed to just be able to do more of what they were already doing or what they were planning to do. We also asked employees about specific forest management challenges, so things like invasive species and WUI area issues, conflicts there. We asked if they had seen that issue in their work, in their everyday work, and if they had done anything to address it. But what's most interesting here is after we asked those first two questions, we asked how related they thought these issues were to climate change. And so the three that I've bolded here were ranked highest or most likely to be related to or influenced by climate change. And for us, that shows that these might be opportunities for places to somehow incorporate climate change adaptation into the management activities that people are already doing. People are already concerned about insect infestations and changes of wildfire regimes. So if there's a way to also be addressing climate change there, that might be a good opportunity. Next, we asked about climate change communication. So we found that the most common ways that people were receiving this kind of information was through informal conversations, just by touch one another. The second and third most common were research papers, first from Forest Service research stations specifically, and then second from any source outside the Forest Service. But what was most interesting to us is if they had received the information in whichever methods we were asking them about, they got to answer a follow-up question about how effective they thought that method was. The methods that ranked most effective, one of them was research papers, so that was good, that went up. But the other was organized meetings and conferences, which were less common. And the methods considered least effective were pretty much email communication of any kind, whether it was from their own level, the regional office, the forest office, or if it was an e-newsletter from the Washington office. Those were considered least effective by the respondents. We also asked employees about forest resilience and how it relates to climate change. Specifically, we asked how they thought each of those two things should be prioritized. And what's interesting is most employees were able to, or decided to rank forest resilience as something that should be more highly prioritized, where the majority believe climate change would only be moderately prioritized. So that's not a huge difference, but there is sort of a pattern that shows they seem to be at least slightly more comfortable with the idea, or more on board with the idea of managing for forest resilience rather than addressing climate change. We asked about how confident they were when it comes to sharing ideas and providing feedback with the Washington office and being heard. This, again, was just regional level employees, these results, but it shows a clear trend that there's sort of very minimally or not at all any sort of level of confidence when it comes to sharing their own ideas and feedback with the Washington office, so we thought that was interesting. So as I mentioned, we did pull some of our final data to take a closer look at some of the regions that were closest to you all. So region 2, if you can see sort of on this map back here, for our purposes included Wyoming and Colorado, and we had about 22% of our respondents from this region, most from the district office, a few from supervisors and regional offices. But we also included the southwestern region, so that was Arizona and New Mexico, and maybe that's not super close to you all, but it was closer than some of the others, and I thought there were some interesting results to be found there. So specifically those two regions, we did some analysis and found how they may have differed from other regions in terms of how the respondents answered some of these questions. So all of the results for the different phrases we have up here were found to be statistically significant at the 0.05 level. The first, in terms of Colorado and Wyoming, respondents from these areas were more likely to have seen changes in species composition, and including Arizona and New Mexico in this one, these respondents were also more likely to believe species composition, or changes in species composition, were related to climate change in some way, more than any other respondents. Also, in terms of Colorado and Wyoming, they believed, or were more likely to believe, that training and education would help when it comes to forest managers' efforts to address climate change, but they were less likely to believe that more efficient NEPA or an ability to do more large-scale management would help. Finally, the respondents from these two states, this area, were less likely to believe that communication within the Forest Service was moderate or very effective. And these were all areas where these people stood out compared to other regions. In terms of Region 3, they were more likely to believe wild-urban land interface issues had something to do with climate change, same with wildlife habitat loss and water quantity or quality issues. In terms of climate change as a concern, they were more likely to believe it was a concern for forest managers, and they were more likely to believe it affected the work that they did. And those were respondents from Arizona and New Mexico. But here's the take-home. So some of the things that we thought were really important based on what we were learning from these results was that the Forest Service should simplify and prioritize, especially when it comes to their methods of communicating climate change information. So we like the idea of them sort of figuring out which of these methods, targeting the ones that have been most effective, and really sort of simplifying both the message and the amount of information. So rather than bombarding employees with dozens of emails, find some more really effective methods and really stick to those. Find some common ground. So if climate change is still sort of has a negative connotation, or if there's something that's holding people back when it comes to that word, maybe consider things like forest resilience or even stewardship as a way to really rally employees. A lot of our interviewees mentioned the idea of, they believe that themselves and their employees really did care about leaving this land in the best possible condition for future generations, regardless of how they felt about climate change. So something else, maybe even if it's just different wording, finding some common ground and really working on that morale and getting employees engaged and excited. By improving the feedback, so we believe there's a lot that can be learned from these lower level employees in terms of their local knowledge and experience. So if the Forest Service really works on sort of soliciting more feedback from these lower level employees, that might really help in the future. So moving forward, we're working on some final analysis with the rest of these results that we gathered, and for us, opportunities like this to talk with people and really share what we've learned outside of maybe an academic publication, we'll certainly pursue those avenues, but things like conversations and maybe reports that we can share with the Forest Service and things that are really important to us to make sure our results are and what we've learned have really sort of made it out into the world and done some good. So I will wrap up by saying thank you to my committee. Zhao and the rest of my committee have been so incredibly helpful, and their expertise has been really great. So I wanted to thank them and thank you all for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie. That was very interesting and informative. And now I'd just like to open it up for questions and comments.
Hi, Jamie. This is Rudy Schuster in Fort Collins, USGS here. One of the questions, you were going through, and there were lots of items that were on the list there. And one of the items was asking if the people think their job is, if they have to think about their job differently, or if they need to just change how they do their job. Do you know the question I'm asking about?
Yes, I think so.
I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about, was that a scale question? Was it a yes/no question? What were people actually responding to? And there's a little more information about what the outcome or answer to that question is.
Sure. So essentially what we asked is how they feel, how they feel climate change. So it was they had three options. It was a multiple choice, and there were three different things that they could select from. And it had to do with how they feel essentially how do they feel things need to be handled going forward, how should Forest Service approach climate change when it comes to moving forward. And the options were, we need sort of a complete overhaul. We need to change the way we think about and do our jobs in order to properly address climate change and take that into consideration. The middle option was this one. We don't necessarily need to change the way we think about our jobs, but some adjustments may be needed. And the third was, we don't need to change anything. We just need to be allowed to do what we're already doing.
Just a quick, can I chip in? This is Zhao. I have the questionnaire right in front of me. So the way we ask questions verbatim is, please think broadly about the general approach to addressing climate change when responding to this question. How do you feel climate change should be addressed by the Forest Service in general? So that was the question. And then Jamie, I think she already laid out the three options we have for people. So they have to pick one out of the three options. And this question was really developed based on the interview results. Some of the verbiage was were listed out of the interview transcripts directly. That's how the interviewees described how they think about this process.
Jamie, this is Linda Joyce over here at the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And I was curious about your comment about simplifying their communication. Could you say a little bit about how you saw the Forest Service communicated climate change, and then what some of the ideas that you have based on how to simplify that?
So some of the things we came across, different ways that the Forest Service is sort of currently communicating climate change information from these surveys and interviews. There are things like webinars, research papers, as I mentioned. There are e-newsletters from the Climate Change Advisor, and then possibly email communication more informally, more formal discussions, conferences and meetings. So just from what we were hearing in our interviews, in some cases in the in the survey was that people felt overloaded with information, and many of them were interested in learning about climate change, but and maybe a lot of it had to do with they just didn't feel like they had the time. So in my mind, we were thinking that the Forest Service should find ways to maybe pick the most effective methods of communication, maybe sort of avoid email if that was one of the ones that kept being ranked as least effective. Pick some of these more effective methods and really focus their energy on getting through to employees through those that are considered most effective, rather than, as I mentioned, sort of just doing a barrage of information and hoping some of it connects.
Hi, this is Kyle Foreman at the USGS. I just wanted to follow up on that. It seems like the most effective, though, were kind of complex that your study found. So, I mean, if it's most effective to have kind of research papers out there, that seems to me like a complex and also time-consuming activity. It's just kind of an interesting finding that you would then say simplify. So I'm just wondering what you were thinking there.
No, you're absolutely right. And organized meetings, conferences, and workshops were actually #1 rated as most effective. But with the Forest Service and the government in general's issue, I mean, they don't have money to send everyone to a conference, obviously, and so there are definitely limitations there. Mostly, we're just showing that what we've found is that these emails are really considered not effective by most employees, and we don't necessarily have a perfect solution to that. We're just sort of showing that employees seem to prefer or consider research papers in these organized meetings most effective. That might not be the perfect solution, but just with all of these different potential methods, our thought is that trying to find a better or more effective way might be the way to go. But you're absolutely right. It's definitely not perfect, and they are, both of them, pretty complex.
And one very interesting thing that Jamie and I have been trying to wrap our head around is if you look at these two most effective communication strategies, the organized meetings and the conferences and workshops are very personal, right? Also, people said that they received most of the information through informal conversations, right? So these meetings and informal conversations are very personal, very, it gives a lot of opportunities for employees to talk to each other, right? So these things are considered effective. And then the next effective thing is actually research paper, which is very impersonal, right? It's just cold data and the facts and science on paper. So we haven't really figured out how to kind of make this finding, find a way to explain these two findings consistently, right? So if you say, oh, well, personal approaches are more effective for communicating information, sharing information, but then you got this research paper, right? But then if you say, oh, objective science is more effective, then you got people, preferring all these workshops and informal conversation. So we're still trying to figure out what's the best way of capturing these kind of results.
This is Rudy Schuster back in Fort Collins. Following up on that, was there any discussion or any more depth into understanding what the informal conversations are? So for example, if you don't know or have an idea of whether the information being conveyed in an informal conversation is accurate, or what kind of what the topic might be, if you're using papers or conferences or workshops or meetings, there's some way monitored or there's some validation of the information that's being conveyed through those more formal networks. And I'm just wondering if the informal conversation, if there was any follow-up or any idea of what information is being conveyed, and if there's any idea of the validity of the information.
No, that's a good point. We got the idea for the informal conversations through the different interviews where they were saying, actually most of the way I learn about climate change is by talking to my buddy or my coworker or asking my boss or whatever the case may be, but we didn't get much more. At the time, we didn't know to ask much more about it, and in the surveys, it was sort of a multiple choice isn't the right word, but there wasn't sort of a more in-depth look at it. That's definitely a good point. all of these different methods, informal conversations aren't tracked or monitored, and it is hard to know what kind of information they're getting.
Yeah, so what we're getting is the perceived effectiveness of these communication strategies, right? Just from an employee perspective, what they think is effective for them. But we really don't have any idea about the quality of the information being communicated and the actual effectiveness of these strategies.
And as you can tell from the slide, informal conversations weren't ranked as one of the top 3 most effective either, so that might be an interesting point as well.
Mm-hmm.
Jamie, this is Shannon. I have a question about your informant population. Would you mind going back to that slide where you had sort of the breakdown of what type of position they had? Because my question is, I think that was it. Yeah. I'm curious, and I don't know if you know the Forest Service, if the GS levels give you the answer to these questions, but you have a variety of different types of positions: scientists, managers, technicians. I'm curious if you did any analysis to sort of break out responses based on more a field manager type position versus a scientist or technician position, and if that gave you different results in terms of some of these questions of, how they receive information and their perceptions, et cetera. Because my guess, especially on the information piece, is that you might get slightly different results if you break it out like that. So I'm curious if you did any of that analysis, or you're going to do any of that type of analysis.
Yeah, that is definitely one of the things we've been looking into. We tried to break. And again, these were self-selected, so and based on our best guesses of what some of these titles might be. So some people, there was another option as well, so some didn't like any of the options we gave them, and some maybe fit into different categories better than others. But we tried to look at, maybe a scientist and a specialist versus more of a field practitioner or a planner as something different. But that is something that we are in the process of looking at to see if their job title or their background has any effect on how they answer some of these questions. But I imagine you're right. I think there's definitely going to be a difference in both how they receive different types of information, how much information they receive, and sort of how they feel about it.
Yeah, and we already did some preliminary analysis. We didn't share today just because we haven't really, double-checked those results. But if I remember right, I think the GS level is actually significantly related to people's perception on whether climate change is a concern, whether that affects the work they do personally, and there was some other variables that are statistically significantly related to the GS level. But I don't think we have done one that separate or categorize all the different positions. So that might be something we can actually do before Jamie needs to defend in April.
This is Linda Joyce. I was struck, Jamie, by the comment that you made, and I'm rephrasing it here to see if I got it correct, that the most positive about Forest Service addressing climate change was at the Washington office level, and then at the district level, and then regional and forest supervisor's office were least positive.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have any thoughts as to why?
My best guess, well, it was from the interviews, and so we had a very small sample, and maybe it doesn't reflect more broadly, but I think maybe some of the people we were talking to in the Washington office were more connected to some of these things we were talking about, and so they were most passionate about it. The people on the ground, that one was a little bit surprising to me. They all seemed to be pretty optimistic in terms of their ability to address these climate change issues. And then I'm not sure why the regions and the forest were the least optimistic, but maybe they are more removed from the issues, or are they dealing with paperwork more often than other people and are just more frustrated? I'm really not sure. And maybe, like I said, maybe it doesn't translate when you look at a bigger population.
It would be interesting to look at your bigger population, because my sense is that the regional office and the forest supervisor's office have to deal with a tremendous amount of political issues, and so they might see bigger fires elsewhere than climate change.
Sure.
Yeah, and also just generally speaking from like the organizational theory perspective, people have argued, like scholars have argued that people who have ability to make on-the-ground changes to the issues that they care about, they generally feel more empowered and maybe sometimes even overconfident in their ability to actually address a particular issue. So in that sense, you know, the people at the district level probably they have a more, I guess, actual management, they can take more actual management actions. And as Jamie said, the supervisor's office and the regional office may be more removed from the actual day-to-day management. And as you said, the political pressure is definitely a consideration too.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments? Rudy, Nina, did you have any other comments about your project and how it might link to, or Karina, Lori, Betsy, anybody on the Southwest project?
I think we're all, you know, not quite sure. I mean, we're all thinking deep thoughts about these things. I mean, one of our thoughts was overlap and looking at the same populations and asking populations, oversampling or overburdening populations was what our original thought was, but I'm not sure if that's necessarily an issue here because of the survey formats and the formats for our projects in the Southwest and the Gunnison and the San Juan. It's much more personal, face-to-face workshop formats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we use the Quadrix survey instrument, survey software, the online software, so it's kind of pretty limiting in terms of, I mean, Quadrix is great, but it's pretty limiting in terms of the depth of the questions we can ask through a survey without, you know, completely, just bore people to death. We really anticipated maybe like 20 to 30 minutes to answer the survey, but after the first round, people were telling us they're taking like an hour and a half to answer the survey question. So we had to make some changes and give up some of the depth to make sure we cover, different topics in our basis. So I'm sure the personal workshop format or face-to-face interview would be much more effective in getting some of the nuance and the in-depth information and insights. We would be really happy to contribute, help any way we can, and to share more results once we have them.
Yeah, hi, it's Karina here from the University of Montana. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you for the presentation. I think it's been, really helpful to get our heads around some of the broader issues for the Forest Service. And I think I don't quite have it formulated in my head right now, but I would be interested in, just staying in touch with you guys, particularly in relation to those questions about the communication of information. If you get any more, if you do any more analysis on that, and it might be something that we can kind of pick up and follow through, because we're really trying to be, we're really interested with our work on trying to deliver this information to managers in the most useful way, or to work with the managers to develop, knowledge which is going to be useful and usable to them. So I think there's probably some overlap somewhere in there, not in like a negative way, but just in terms of thinking through that question about how you've got such different answers in relation to the personal ways of communicating through the informal conversations versus those kind of more objective research papers. And, maybe that's something that we can follow up on in terms of what is it about those two particular modes of communication which people find most helpful. Because I think you're probably getting, I think you could make an assumption that you're getting a very different, knowledge of a very different nature through those two forms of communication. And so there's probably something to think about and follow up on through there.
Definitely.
Well, and again,
we
Karina,
will be very interested in following up on that. And there's a whole body of literature looking at different ways of knowing, right? So I think this is just scratching the surface of looking at, different information sources and the effectiveness, but I think definitely more work needs to be done. So for example, whether or not the information people exchange through these informal conversations are valid information, that's a big question, right? We can try to figure out opportunities to set up platforms for people to informally exchange, but what if the information they exchange is actually, reinforcing the wrong perceptions or reinforcing the wrong science? Then we're actually, shooting ourselves in the foot. So definitely there's more work and almost even like experimental work that need to be done with this regard.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Karina, I was just going to say too, I mean, my hypothesis, like I said earlier, is that we might not be able to generalize those two most popular information exchange mechanisms across the whole population. My hypothesis is when you break it down, more of the scientists are going to be in the research paper camp and more of the, I don't know. I mean, maybe the field managers will be more in the face-to-face, maybe not. But I think that's an empirical question that needs to be tested instead of, making the assumption that those results apply across the board.
Well, I do.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Sorry, Karina.
No, that's fine. I mean, I completely agree. That's kind of what I was. Anyway, doesn't matter.
No, we will definitely finish the analysis of the larger population, and I want to just kind of make I think Jamie already talked about it, but I just want to make a note on the fact that our survey was really more a census rather than a sampling of Forest Service employees, right? So in the region of our interest, we got the full list, the complete list of all the national forests, and we got the directorate of each national forest with everybody's contact information and their job title, right? So we went through people one by one and take out all the ones related to IT maintenance or, human resources that are not pertinent to this particular forest management question, and we kept everybody else in our list, contact list, and we sent the survey to all of them. So I think the power, or at least the part that I'm really excited about this study, is it really shows pretty well within this region how employees think, right? So I actually think the generalizability of the results, once we finish doing the whole analysis of the whole population, is actually quite good.
Hi, this is Nina in Fort Collins, and also I would like to thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. And I just have a couple of things to ask you, and one is just sort of a procedural thing, and I'm wondering if we might be able to have this presentation to look over, if that's possible. I think I have some questions, but it's hard to remember what they all might be, so I wouldn't mind if you can share the presentation. That would be great. And then the second thing, and this is something about Forest Service. So on the scorecard, they are aiming to get at least 7 of 10 of those items. Are all of those items equally important to them, or are there some on that list that they say are essential and that they must attain those? Or are they equivalent?
I didn't get the impression that any were maybe more important than others. The only thing I can say is some seem to indicate that some of them were more easier to achieve than others, and maybe some were just sort of naturally already in place. I think the general impression I got was they're shooting for all of them. They're all very important.
Right.
They're all something that they want to get to eventually.
Okay, yeah, on paper, if you look at the national roadmap, basically they say all the 10 items need to be addressed, right? And they didn't really prioritize one over another. So on paper, they're equally important. But just as Jamie said, and also our interviewee told us, it's much easier to achieve some of these items than other items. But also the national roadmap actually said, well, the goal is not just to have 7 out of 10 checked by 2015. It's also to have at least 1 item from each category checked, right? So there are 4 categories. So they don't want to see, all 7 from category 1 to category 2, but there's nothing in adaptation or mitigation. So they want to see at least one thing achieved for each category. So in that way, I guess there's some kind of a balance in terms of the efforts needed.
Right. Okay. And I know this wasn't really what your study was about, but it's interesting just to wonder if maybe some of the people in the Washington office are more focused on the scorecard and people out at the field office level are more focused on doing things on the ground.
Yeah, we definitely should look into that. We will. In fact, that's very interesting. And if you look at the scorecard, the first part is organizational capacity, right? The number 1 is education, whether people are provided with information and training. So, that's a very easy check, right? Almost everybody we talk to from different national forests, they check that one. And the number 2 is designated climate change coordinators. Right now, every single national forest or grassland already have a coordinator, right? So that's an easy check as well. But if you look at some of the items under adaptation, like vulnerability assessment, that's an easy word to say, but it involves so much work, right? So that's like a much harder, or adaptation activities or monitoring, those are much harder items to check. So it's kind of interesting that actually it would be interesting if we can get some kind of data to look at the distribution of the checks of these 10 items. Oh yeah, I wonder if we can get that from somewhere.
So, I guess the assumption is that if you do those 10 things, you're in good shape and you're really dealing with climate change impacts. That's really true.
Yeah, as you mentioned in our interviews, it kept coming up from the ranger district level employees that they, in a sense, they feel like they have too many fires to put out as it is to worry about climate change. So I definitely was getting that sense too, that it might be the case that the higher up you go, the more concerned they are with checking these boxes and being able to show results, whereas on the ground they're feeling overwhelmed and they just want to be able to handle the day-to-day worries that they already have.
Yeah, it's sort of like the no child left behind equivalent in a way.
I like that. I like that comparison. Oh, just a quick response to an earlier question about sharing this particular presentation. We are doing this as an independent study. I mean, we received support from the Forest Service, from the Washington office, but not in a binding way. So I think we should be able to share at least a PDF of this presentation. But if possible, I would appreciate if you don't distribute it to other people without us knowing, because Jamie hasn't defended her thesis yet, and then we are working on some publications out of this work. So we don't want the results to be out before we have opportunities to do those things.
Yeah, totally fine. We sort of operate the same way. So whatever you can share with us and whenever you can do it is fine. But just know that we're interested in kind of keeping up with this and seeing what it is you can share with us.
Great. And as Jamie finished up her writing and we clean up our results, we can certainly share the draft manuscripts with people as well. Maybe we can, get back in touch with Shannon and see if there's a way to do that with a group.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Zhao and Jamie. We're pushing up against the hour, so I think unless anybody has any burning questions they want to slide in here before we get going, we should probably wrap it up. Does anyone want to make one last comment or question before we end the webinar?
This is a little off topic, but I have to say the pictures in the presentation were beautiful, so thank you.
Nice.
Yeah, Jamie is the dream graduate student. I have been really lucky to have her working with me. So, and also I want to just thank everybody for taking an interest in our work.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you guys, and thanks everyone for taking the time this afternoon. And reminder, our next webinar will be on March 14th, and everybody enjoy your weekend. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Zhao.
Yeah,
no problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.